By 1934, the dust storms were relentless, and Emma knew there wasn't much left to save. The crops had turned to dust, her husband's back had been broken by toil, and the walls of their farmhouse were no match for the ever-encroaching winds. But in the quiet, on the hottest day of the year, she would try something they thought was impossible. Before we dig deeper into Emma's story, let us know where you're watching from and if you believe in the power of survival against the odds. If true stories like this move you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's tale may just outlast today's. The sun, a pale and unforgiving disk in the sky, hung above their farmhouse like a judgmental eye. The land, once rich with promise and possibility, had become little more than a powdery expanse of cracked earth. Emma stood by the open window, watching the horizon. There wasn't a whisper of wind yet, but she could feel it coming, the deep, rattling hum that would signal another storm. It had been weeks since the last one, but each passing day stretched thinner than the one before. There was no rain, only the eternal dust, blowing from all directions, leaving everything suffocated in a coating of gray. Inside, the house felt even smaller. The air had grown stale, as if it too was trapped in the oppressive stillness. Her husband, Jack, had tried to fix the roof twice in the past month, but the tar would not hold against the cracks that split the rafters every time the wind shifted. It was no use. The dust came in anyway, making a home of every crevice. The walls seemed to be collapsing inward, or maybe it was just Emma's mind giving way to the weight of it all. Jack was at the far side of the kitchen, sitting by the stove, his worn fingers wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. He didn't speak much these days. He didn't have to. His tired eyes said enough. "Maybe we should leave," he said, his voice hoarse. "Take the truck and go. Maybe head south." Emma glanced out the window again. The earth stretched as far as her eyes could see, a barren wasteland dotted with the occasional overturned plow or abandoned farmhouse. There was no escape, no way to outrun the dust, the poverty, the land that had turned on them. "We stay," she said, almost to herself. "We can't leave. Not yet." The thought of walking away from this place, from the land that had been in her family for generations, was impossible to fathom. But Emma had also learned that if you didn't fight back, the earth would swallow you whole. Maybe that was the key. Maybe she had to stop running from the storm and learn to endure it. She turned away from the window and began sorting through the remnants of their meager supplies. The idea that had been eating at her for days wouldn't leave her mind, building something to keep the house cool. It was crazy, she knew, but if she could create even a small breeze on these suffocating days, it would be a small victory. They couldn't fix the roof, couldn't make the dust disappear, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way to survive in the heat. That night, as Jack went to bed early, exhausted from the day's labor, Emma stayed up. She couldn't rest, not with the thought of the dust hanging thick and heavy in her mind. The house felt like it was closing in on her, the silence broken only by the occasional scrape of the wind outside. She had seen people use old-fashioned methods to cool homes, but those ideas seemed too foreign for someone like her. Still, Emma's mind was restless, and desperation made her think of something she had once heard about in a book her mother had kept by the hearth, an evaporative cooler. It was a simple idea, really. Using water to cool the air. But with no power to run a fan, she would have to make do with what they had. As the hours dragged on, Emma's imagination began to take over. She found herself down in the small barn, rummaging through old scrap wood and discarded tools. Her father had been a carpenter, so she knew the basics. A small fan could be made from old window frames, and she could attach dampened rags to it to allow the air to cool as it passed through. It wouldn't be much, but maybe it would work. The idea seemed foolish, even to her. But when the sun finally rose the next morning, Emma was already busy building. The house, which had felt like a tomb for weeks, now felt alive with the prospect of something, anything, that might offer relief. She worked quietly, her hands moving mechanically, driven by necessity rather than belief. The rags were tied tightly to the window frame, and she used a simple lever to turn the makeshift fan she had fashioned from scrap wood and the rusted gears she had found lying in the back of the barn. It wasn't much, but by the time Jack woke up, Emma had a small contraption set up by the front door. She knew it wouldn't be a miracle, but she also knew they had no other choice. The sun was already high in the sky, and the wind was beginning to pick up again, warning of the coming storm. When Jack stepped out of the bedroom and saw the contraption, his first reaction was disbelief. "What is that?" "A way to cool the house," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Jack didn't argue. He didn't have the energy for it. Instead, he moved toward the door, looking at the makeshift fan with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "It might not work," Emma added, almost apologetically. Jack didn't respond at first. He stood still for a moment, then, without a word, reached down to test the water-soaked rags. The slight breeze that passed through was weak but noticeable. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Let's see how long it lasts," he said quietly. He seemed to understand that this was more than a fan. It was a sign that Emma was not ready to give up, not yet. And so, with the dust swirling on the horizon and the heat threatening to choke them, Emma and Jack waited, the cool breeze offering a fleeting hope that even in the worst of times they might find a way to endure. The days that followed were like the ones before, hot, oppressive, and filled with the never-ending sound of the wind. The dust hung thick in the air, and though the makeshift fan Emma had constructed offered a small reprieve, it didn't bring the relief she had hoped for. The breeze, though welcome, wasn't enough to quell the heat that clung to the inside of the house, a constant reminder of how fragile their existence had become. But even in the midst of these small failures, something shifted. For the first time in what felt like years, Emma felt the stirrings of determination. It was as if the wind outside, carrying the dust and the heat, had whispered a challenge into her ear, daring her to defy it, and she wasn't ready to surrender. Every morning now, Jack took his place by the window, watching the horizon, waiting for the storm to arrive. There was a quiet rhythm to it, the routine of survival: wake, work, wait for the storm. Yet, it was in this small moment of stillness, the quiet anticipation of the day ahead, that Emma found a kind of clarity. She knew there was no escaping the dust, no escaping the heat, but she also knew that every small act of defiance, every new idea, was one more step toward survival. The fan, though primitive, became a small symbol of this defiance. Every time Jack tested it, or Emma made adjustments to improve its cooling power, they were reaffirming something deep within themselves. They weren't giving up. They couldn't. But the next storm, as Emma had feared, arrived as it always did, without warning. The sky darkened, a sickly brown hue, and the winds kicked up the dirt so fiercely that it felt like the earth itself was spinning out of control. The fan groaned under the pressure of the wind, its fragile frame rattling. Emma watched as dust poured in, through every crack, as the house once again became a suffocating box. Jack didn't say anything. He couldn't. They both knew what it meant. The storm was more than just a weather event. It was a reminder of their isolation, of how quickly they could be overrun by the elements. But Emma wasn't willing to let this one defeat them. As the storm raged outside, she stood by the fan, dampened rags in hand, adjusting the makeshift structure. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but the one thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't stop now. Jack, silently watching her, understood this. For the next few hours, Emma fought against the storm, adjusting the fan as the dust poured through the cracks and crevices of the house. Each time the fan failed to work, she adjusted it again. It was a futile, endless task, but it was hers, and in that there was power. The idea of surrender was a luxury neither of them could afford. Eventually, the storm passed. The sun returned, the winds quieted, and the air began to settle. When Emma looked around, the house was even more covered in dust than before, but she didn't care. It was the first time in months she had allowed herself to believe that they could survive this. Maybe it wasn't the fan or the water-soaked rags that would save them, but the relentless will to continue, the refusal to accept that this was the end. The days after the storm passed were silent, as if the world itself was taking a moment to recover. The air had a heavy stillness to it, the kind that followed a battle. Emma stood at the window, looking out across the land, but it no longer seemed as oppressive. She wasn't sure if it was the calm after the storm or the simple fact that she had made it through another one, but she found herself seeing things differently. Jack was outside, as usual, checking the fences and the barn, doing the tasks that seemed so small yet so necessary. The storm had tested them in ways they hadn't expected, but now that it had passed, the urgency seemed to have settled in a different way. It wasn't about surviving the next storm. It was about surviving the silence in between. That afternoon, as Emma worked inside, she heard a knock at the door. She paused, unsure if she had heard it correctly. The last few months had felt like they were trapped in a time loop, a world where nobody came and nothing changed. But the knock was real. She opened the door cautiously, heart racing, expecting to see nothing but the endless stretch of land in front of her. Instead, standing in the doorway was a man older than Jack but strong-looking, wearing a weathered hat and a dusty jacket. He looked like a stranger, yet something about him felt familiar. His eyes, dark and tired, scanned the room behind her, settling on Emma with a knowing expression. "I heard about you," the man said, his voice rough from the dust and the heat. "Heard you built something to keep your house cool. Thought I'd come see it for myself." Emma stepped back, instinctively reaching for the doorframe to steady herself. "Who are you?" "Name's Thomas," the man said. "I've been traveling around, looking for ways to survive this dust. Thought you might have something that works." Emma stood still for a long moment, weighing the options. The last thing they needed was another mouth to feed, but she also knew something about survival. You never knew when someone might have the help you needed. "Well, come on in then," she said after a long pause. "Let's see if it's worth the trouble." As Thomas stepped inside, Emma couldn't help but feel the weight of her own invention, something so simple yet so important: the fan, the cooling system. It wasn't much, but for the first time in weeks, Emma allowed herself to believe in it fully. It might not change the world, but it had kept them cool enough to survive the storm, and maybe that was enough. The road ahead would be long, they all knew that. But Emma realized as Thomas sat down at the table that survival wasn't just about getting through another day. It was about reaching out, sharing what you had, and pushing forward together. In the midst of the dust and the heat, they could still find ways to hold on. And for that, Emma felt grateful. Weeks passed, and the farm continued its slow battle against the elements. Emma's invention, though crude, proved itself in small ways. With every new storm that rolled through, it offered a slight reprieve, a cool breath of air that made the oppressive heat bearable. Jack, though still weary, found himself tinkering with the fan, adding his own touches, and working alongside Thomas, who had stayed on to help with the repairs and upkeep. There was no great victory. The dust still came, the sun still burned, and the land remained unyielding. But what had once been a house full of silence and fear had begun to feel like a place of quiet resilience. The storm's aftermath had shifted something within them all. A subtle change in perspective. Emma had stopped waiting for the winds to take them down. Instead, she focused on the small victories, the moments of survival that came with each day they stayed on the land. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, the wind finally died down, leaving the air still and cool. Emma stood outside, watching the colors change in the sky. It wasn't much the windless night, the small satisfaction of a house that had withstood yet another storm, but it was enough. "Jack," she called softly, looking over her shoulder. He was standing at the barn, staring out across the field. "We're still here," she whispered to herself, as much a reminder as a truth. He didn't answer immediately, but when he did, it was with a soft nod. "We are." And that, in the end, was all that mattered. They were still here, and they would keep on fighting.